Hey folks, welcome to another episode. I'm back out in the woods, and this is the start of a new series which is kind of carrying on with the Viking Age theme. I've recently put up a kind of full build video of the Viking house that I did with Dustin down in Somerset in England, Western England. So if you'd like to see that, maybe before watching this episode, I'll put a link to that just up here somewhere or in the video description below. So today, well, in the next few days, I am attempting to build a kind of, well, it's a Viking Age structure, but it's more, I've been inspired by the Icelandic turf houses that the Vikings built over there. They're a completely different style to the one that I'd built previously with Dustin and Dad, and obviously they have turf involved. Now, this is, for those history buffs out there, this is not going to be historically correct. It's just going to be my interpretation on an Icelandic turf house. So, just quickly, I just want to explain why the Vikings built these kind of turf houses over in Iceland. It's kind of a harsh environment over there, and they didn't have many trees. And as I've said previously, the Vikings were very resourceful people. They, many of them were farmers, really. I know that it's been kind of glorified in the modern era of what Vikings did with the pillaging and the raids and things like that. That obviously did happen, but to be honest, I think most tribes and most cultures did that. So a lot of them were farmers. Part of the reason they invaded Britain was because of the fertile soil and things that we had over here. So they went to Iceland, and there wasn't many trees. Now, I'm only speculating here because we don't really know. It was so long ago, we don't really know exactly the type of structure that they built. We can only gauge it by the foundations that were left. So they didn't have many trees, which meant they didn't kind of build their longhouse structures, which was typical of the Viking Age. So what they did, again, which is really awesome, was they used turf. And to put it simply, they would build up walls of turf and then add a kind of what they could, timber frame, small basic rudimentary timber frame above the turf itself. And the reason being is, obviously, like I say, Iceland was probably still does, I've never been there, I'd love to go there, maybe my Icelandic subscribers can help, but it's quite a harsh climate at times, certain times of the year, strong winds from the Atlantic Ocean, which meant that they needed to build these structures with thick walls that would keep the wind off. And obviously, being Iceland, it's also very cold, especially in the winter months. So these turf houses actually retained a lot of the temperature. They kept a very even temperature throughout the winter and the summer months. Now, because they were building with turf, when you look at the pictures of Icelandic turf houses, they have buzzard. They have a kind of quite a shallow pitch on the roof, so that the turf would stay on there and they could build it up in layers. Now, as I say, my take on this is going to be slightly different. Probably not going to be as much turf involved. They spent a lot of time preparing the turf itself. I'm not sure. It's certainly going to have a turf style roof, and it's going to have that low pitch. So it's going to be something completely different to what you've seen on the channel before. And it's going to be built just next to the Saxon house. And I'm also going to explain later why I'm doing this, why I do these kind of things with these historic structures, and also a little bit about the land that I'm building on. But for now, I've just been burning the ends of the logs to help preserve the wood as it goes into the ground. So you can see where I've burnt the ends of the logs here. Let's take this one, for example. It's still a bit warm. But I took off the bark from about here downwards. It's only going into the ground up to about here, but if there's any rain as it's in the ground like that, if there's any rain that splashes up, it might splash up here and just, make it rot a bit quicker. So I've taken the bark off from there to there. The reason you take the bark off, or the reason I take the bark off, is it generally helps preserve the wood a bit longer. It stops bugs tend to live under the bark in most trees, especially when they're dead. This is dead wood. Again, something I'll explain later. But they tend to live under the bark. They eat away at the inside of the the wood itself, and then fungi and things like that can grow inside, and it just rots away. So by taking off the bark, it decreases the chance of it rotting quickly. It will still rot, but it reduces that speed at which it rots. So I could still put that into the ground and it would last longer than it would had it had the bark on. But you can help preserve it even longer by burning or charring the exterior, the outside of the wood itself. This works twofold. It actually, I'm pretty sure, obviously it helps evaporate any moisture that's in there anyway. The bugs will then not want to go in there because it's charred wood and it's not really, they're not going to eat that kind of thing. They will eventually as it fades off and chips off, but it's quite off-putting for the bugs. But also I think it gets rid of all the starch inside of the wood, or some of the starch inside of the wood, which helps to prevent bacteria build-up. So in the long run, it's just helping to preserve that wood even longer as it goes in the ground. I could have burnt this whole log, but that would have taken quite a bit of time, and I only really want to burn the bit that's going into the ground. So that's the reason I'm doing it. I'd say the Vikings possibly did something like that as well, but it is an ancient Japanese technique and it's still used in the modern day, so it must be working if people are still using it. These are the bits that's going in. Now also here I've just created some basic tenon joints, and I need to make some mortise joints in a minute, the holes of which these tenons will go in. I just used the standard saw that I've been using. They are a bit rudimentary, they're quite basic, but they're only going to serve the purpose of just holding the support beams in place. So it's kind of a post and beam structure to begin with, and I've got to adjust the depths of the holes to help give me that pitch on that roof to make it shallow. But yeah, that's what I've done there. I have 6 posts overall, and I've not drawn this out, I've just done it in my mind, I've pictured it. I've been picturing it for a few months now. It's a smaller shelter, it's kind of a one-man style shelter, and it should be fun. Thank you very much for joining me on this series. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get these posts in the ground and start to put together a frame. When I'm compressing the dirt like this, I have a stick which has a kind of thick end here and it tapers down to a narrow end here, and that's because inevitably this isn't going to be too central in the hole because of stones and things down there. So there's always going to be a narrow side, which is this side, and a wider side, which is that side. So this fatter end of the stick can compress the soil on this wide side, and then this narrow side here, I can use the narrower side of the stick to compress it. And what I find is when you first, because I've got a gravel layer here as well, I've dug down to the gravel layer, when you first put these stones in, that's what I tend to do first because it helps to just stabilise this log, and then I'll put the clay and gravel and soil on top of that to compress it down. So I've made some really, and I mean very basic, mortise holes here, just using the chisel and a bit of the knife. They're pretty scraggly, but it's near enough rectangular. I don't need it to look immaculate inside because it's going to just sit on top of the two centre poles there. But with the Saxon house, what I did with the mortise hole is I actually punched all the way through the beam, the sort of tie beam, the support beam, like this basically. I punched all the way through and that hole went all the way through to the other side. Now that meant when it sat on the tenon joint like this, the tenon up here was exposed, which meant that obviously rain and everything could get into the joint and eventually rot it away. So to prevent that, in that episode of the Saxon house, I used some pine tar and just sealed it over the top, but I basically created work for myself. Whereas with this one, I've not gone all the way through, I've only gone the height of the tenon. I made sure that the tenons were smaller, only about a couple of inches instead of, you know, 3 or 4 inches like the previous Saxon house ones. And that way, that will, imagine the tenons there, that will sit on top like that, and then it's completely kind of weather sealed from the top here. If the rain hits here, it's not going to get into the joint. A little bit will drip down, but nothing like where it's exposed at the top. With this ridgepole, what I should have done really is got a wider ridgepole. Hopefully you can see that, but there's an overhang here, which means that the rain can hit this overhang and then get into the joint here. It shouldn't matter too much once the roof's on anyway, but just as a, you know, as something that I've learned when doing this is you don't want this part of your post beams exposed to the elements. So really, if I'd have got this ridge beam maybe an inch wider just on one side, then it would have covered this whole joint here, and you know, it would be less exposed. But it is what it is. It sits nicely on there, and that's my ridge pole. Now I've got to do the 2 side supports and wall posts. What I'm doing here is I'm just flattening out this mortise joint so that when it sits on top of the tenon it's nice and flush. If it was kept rounded, then when it comes up against the tenon, even though the tenon will slot in, it's got more chance to roll to the side. So, you know, generally with a roundwood timber you want to keep that joint nice and flat, just so that everything sits flush. Otherwise it's just going to rock on that tenon joint and just wear it away. So I'm just using the draw knife to flatten it off. It's a bit spalted, this. Obviously, like I say, I'm using dead wood. Ideally, if you're building, you know, proper timber frame things, you would use better wood than this, better condition. But if you see that mark there, that's, hopefully you can see that. It's kind of this black spalted line. It's like someone scribbled on it with a pencil. And that is a sign that the wood is obviously dead and dying back, and it's starting to spalt and then rot. But this is in good enough condition, I can see by the grain there, that it's going to be okay for a sort of support post. Horizontal beam. Those for a cold night, easy, nice and dry, nice and thin, easy to get a fire going again with that. You may have noticed as well, I hold my draw knife the other way up. That's because this draw knife isn't really for roundwood timber. It's for square timbers, kind of chamfering off the edge of table legs and chairs for furniture making. You can see the bevel there. There's the first bevel, and then there's the sort of secondary bevel. If I use it this side up, what happens is it digs too deep. You can see there, it's digging. It's not, I'm pulling hard and it's not smooth, and that's because of the angle of this bevel. But if I flip it up, you can see by that angle it's going to push the bark upwards and away from the log, which is what I need. This is more for like tapering. It's going to be tapering down. So if I have it this way, it's going to want to taper down. But if I reverse it, so the bevel's facing up, it's going to want to push away from the log and towards me, and then lift that bark off. I can show you just on the edge here. Like that, see it curl towards me? I'll do it again. There, it's curling towards me. So yeah, it's not the ideal curved draw knife for this type of thing, but it is, if I flip it, it does the job and it curls it. Where it's like that, sometimes you can just get your knife where the curls are a bit too deep for the draw knife there, just get my knife and batten it down, rock it, and then that all slides off and I get a bit more of a flush joint. So the way that I do the mortise hole measurement is really basic. I rest one end, so where's that flat end there? I rest one end of the log up there. Bear in mind I'm on my own, so it's not as easy. If I was with someone, they could hold that other end for me. But I rest one end up there, and I come to this end, make sure it's flat and it's central. It's all done by eye. I'm not using measure. And then I've got a piece of charcoal here, and I just roughly mark around the edge of the tenon joint. And I mean roughly, it's a piece of charcoal, like it's really not accurate, but it's enough to give me an outline. It's just hard to keep it all balanced without it all dropping off. Come around the other side, mark around there. Hopefully you can see that line that I used with the charcoal there to mark off that rectangle. I've also tapered this tenon joint, so it starts wide here and tapers down. That's just so it all sits in a bit easier. It just slides on easier because I'm on my own lifting these logs, and you know, it's not ideal when one side's balancing and I have to really hit it down. So it still goes to the flush point here, but I've just tapered it all in a bit just so it's easier to get on by myself. So there's my mortise joint, drawing that I did with a bit of charcoal. Here is my 1-inch auger bit, and this is a barrelized Scotch auger. So a lot of you ask what it is. It's just, here's the barrel eye. If I can get the stick out, there you can see that's the kind of barrel eye there. 1 inch, which is essentially the width across there. And the reason it's a barrel eye is because it's open, so you use a stick and you can just wiggle it. I slide it down there so it tapers, so it's thin, so it goes in, and then the stick gets wider this side, so it jams up against it. Pinch it in, twist it a couple of times, and that's now solid. It's not like going anywhere. So 3 holes probably, one there, one in the middle, one on the end, and that takes away a chunk of the material. But remember, last time I went all the way through this log, and that then exposes the joint. I don't want to do that. The tenon is only about that big, so I only need to go in that far, and then it's all going to sit flush, one would hope. And when I'm using the auger to begin with, because it's an old one as well, I just push in hard to begin with, so that just pierce the wood, and then that bit's going to bite. I can feel it biting already, and I don't need to put too much pressure on. I just turn. There you go. And that now chews into the wood without me having to put pretty much any pressure on at all. Sometimes if it's a fairly hard wood and the grain's quite tight, I'll have to lean on it a bit or sharpen the auger fairly regularly as well. But now I just wind away and do the other 2 holes as well. Okay, that's the second hole. I did actually go through the kind of wall there, so there's a gap. So now all I've got to do is chisel away there. I've removed so much material already, so that's helpful. And then one more hole on the end. Yeah, a little bit deep in that one, but should be right. One more hole here, and then we're good to go. Push it hard. There you go. Alright, let's see how it's done. See that being removed? That material. And then I go down again, chisel a bit deeper. And when it's kind of full of stuff, I don't want to be chiseling back into that. I turn the log upside down and bang it. And that all comes out and it just clears it a bit better. So there's my mortise. it's pretty butchered up. That's probably because A, my skill level, but also the grain on this is on pine is very twisty. It's also dead, so it's quite hard to work with. You know, it's like partially spalted, as I said earlier, so it's rotting a bit. But that's pretty much it. It's a rectangle. It's not done with a pencil or anything like that. It is just done by eye. So you can kind of see the roundwood timber frame that I've built. It's only a small structure, like I say, it's only going to be really a one-man, maybe a two-man. That's it. It's not going to be anything like the Saxon house. You can see that one side is quite close to the centre pole and one side's a bit further away. That is done on purpose because this is going to have quite a steep pitch on this side, and this side's going to have a much shallower pitch, because I'd like to eventually have a turf roof on the top of it, which is where the whole inspiration came from. And yeah, that's why I've created a nice shallow angle. And you might be thinking, Mike, where's the turf? It's meant to be an Icelandic inspired turf house, but where is the turf? Now, I don't really want to be digging up too much turf. There is not much turf here. You can see it's mostly bracken and kind of pine duff and pine needles. There's not much in the way of actual turf. There's a kind of glade over there which I may use, but I don't want to be sort of, you know, digging up too much, because traditionally what they would have done is this whole wall here and this whole wall here would have been completely built out of turf. There wouldn't have been tree, like I've used trees and poles there. There wouldn't have been poles there. It would have just been turf. But like I say, this is kind of my own take on it. I will be using turf at some point, but at the moment I just wanted to use a basic roundwood timber frame and work around that, because that's, you know, that's going to be a lot of turf just to get from all the way up here all the way up there. That's a lot of turf. Now I may dig out the inside just like we did with the Saxon house and create a bit more of a pit and use some of that turf there. I'm not sure yet. Maybe you guys feel free to put some input on it, but I don't want to be digging up too much of the surrounding area. So for this side, like I say, I may not use the turf, I'm not sure yet, but the actual shape and design is definitely inspired by the Icelandic style Viking houses, which you will see probably better in the next episode. You can see where the burnt sections of the logs are still sticking up out of the ground. This one probably could have done with a bit more higher up. That way if it rains there, it's still a bit more protected up on this bit here. Just a little bit more protection from the rain. And yeah, so you can kind of get an idea of the shape. I guess entrance might be this side, because I made that slightly higher than that side. So head may be that side, I'm still not sure yet. But it's going to look, you know, it's going to look really good. Next to, obviously, the Saxon house here. It's going to take its shape, and then we'll have a kind of Anglo-Saxon structure and a Viking structure. And yeah, we can cook up some really cool feasts and just enjoy time in the woods, living a little bit like our ancestors did. So before I round off this episode, I feel I owe you guys a bit of an explanation, really, because I've had quite a few questions lately, especially with the Viking house stuff, the Saxon house stuff, and I feel it's time to answer because I'm getting them a little bit more frequently now, and it's quite difficult to keep up with comments all the time. I do my best to try and get back to you guys, but obviously I'm out here or somewhere making a film. But one of the questions I do get asked fairly regularly is with bushcraft in general and camping, what about the kind of leave no trace aspect? This is hardly leaving no trace. It's, you know, some gargantuan structure that's, you know, not natural in the woodland, doesn't look natural when you see it. And I completely understand those comments, I really do. Let me explain to you why I'm kind of doing this, really. I'm all for the leave no trace, definitely. I think if you're out there on public land especially, you really should leave no trace. If you're going camping, you have a fire, make sure that you make the site look like you've never even been there. Take only pictures and leave only footprints, as they say. I'm all for that. The thing is, with private land, which is what I'm on here, it might be slightly different. So I have permission to be here. I've had this permission since before YouTube. So what's that, 15 years? I can't remember when YouTube started, 2004, maybe 5, 6, can't remember. I've had this permission before YouTube was even existed, and I've been using this woodland since before YouTube. So, you know, some people say, oh, you're building all these structures just to get views, you're just milking it and things like that. I'm really not. You know, obviously views are important when you're a full-time YouTuber, but I'm not doing it to milk views. I'm doing it because I want to get in touch a bit and feel a bit how our ancestors lived and experience that, and use fairly minimal tools and basic tools, and just live a little in the past as such. There might be a plane go past at some point, I can hear it in the distance, so apologies for that. But that's really, you know, I have a passion for that. I really love my history. I'm not a history expert, I just really enjoy it. And I love my bushcraft, and I like incorporating both of those and doing that bit of experimental archaeology. Now, like I said, I've had this permission here. This is private land. I've had this permission for many, many years. I would no way ever build things like this on public land. You know, for those asking, why would you do that? Why would you build something like this that's just going to scar the landscape? I would never do this on public land. You've seen my camping videos. If you go back through my camping videos and my bushcraft overnights and things like that, you will see me clear up my site after I've been. So, I take great responsibility when I'm out doing this sort of thing, but I do realise at the same time that I might be encouraging people to do this sort of thing on public land. So that's why I feel it's my duty, my responsibility to say to you guys, please don't do this sort of thing on public land. If you're going to do this, you need to ask permission especially obviously from the landowner. You need to have respect for what you're doing and for the impact that you might have. So, you know, I'd like to get that message across to some of you. I know it's a bit of a dour point, but please do leave no trace. You know, I've got permission to do this. The other thing is, again, explaining to the people who say that, oh, he's doing it just for views. These shelters that I built with Dustin, I built this with Dad, and the one I'm doing now, they do get used by various groups of kids and teachers and things like that. They do get used. They're not just built for the sake of YouTube views. There is a purpose behind it, and it's there to educate the next generation, and that's partly why I do the videos as well and why I document it, because I want to keep that knowledge alive. I know I might be preachy a bit in this segment, and I apologise to those for that, but I just needed to clear it up because I've had a few questions lately, and like I say, I have a fairly big, I have a big audience. I have a lot of people watching me. I just hope that you guys are responsible when you're out there and make sure you have the correct permission and you're doing it for the right reasons. But anyway, that aside, thank you for watching this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. I appreciate, again, it's not completely historically accurate, but I want to thank the people, the Icelandic Vikings, for giving me some inspiration on this build. And yeah, it will get good use, and hopefully you guys will enjoy following me on this journey of this historic little area that I've got here in the woods, where we can cook up some feasts, have some mead, and just enjoy learning about the past. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you soon in the next episode.